Welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Awes Freeman. I'm the Assistant Professor and Program Director of Theology and the Arts here. And this week I'm introducing myself. So there you have it. I'm going to try and give an overview of my new book, Good Shepherd, Image, Meaning, and Power, that's just out by Baylor University Press. And so I'm going to give an overview, basically introduce the project, try and do a quick overview of the chapters and examples of the arguments in each of the chapters, and then have some time for Q&A at the end. So also trying to keep an eye on the time. And the origins of this project actually came when I was a doctoral student at Vanderbilt University, and my advisor, Robin Jensen, who's a very practical person, had me, instead of writing a term paper, we were doing a class on, it was actually an independent study on monuments in Rome in late antiquity and early Christianity. And she had me create my own image database, basically, and kind of notes on each of these major monuments. And then instead of writing kind of like a traditional research paper, I wrote a series of paper proposals for the future. So I think I did 5 or 6, and it basically consisted of a paragraph or 2 and then an annotated bibliography that I then had potential projects for the future. So that when a couple of years later, somebody reached out to me to be on a panel about church and empire in early Christianity, I was like, oh, I think I have this proposal from a while ago. I went back and looked at it and then expanded it into a conference paper. And then, I gotta fix this recording. And then actually that conference panel ended up being turned into an edited volume. And so it was turned into a chapter in that. And then when the editor of Baylor reached out to me and asked if I had a project several years ago, I said, oh, I have this chapter in an edited volume, and I think I could take each of those sections and expand it out into chapters. And I think there's still more to do with that. So that's kind of the timeline. And I think for those of you who are in graduate school who are maybe thinking about if there are projects or questions that kind of nag at you, they might have future iterations and think about other ways of exploring them. Conferences are a great way to do that. The new symposium week is a great way to do that at United. So lots of opportunities for that. And I mentioned before we started recording that I'm going to try and stick to this transcript so that I can keep us on time. And I'll try to do that. So forgive me for kind of reading off of this, but we'll have some conversation. Okay, so I'm going to start by just kind of explaining why this project, or what the question is. A common conception of early Christianity and its visual culture has been that the pre-Constantinian church, so before the legalization of Christianity, that is, and its visual culture has been that it was a peaceful grassroots organization, and that their depictions of Jesus as a philosopher, teacher, healer, and shepherd reflected this. As the story goes, this was all corrupted by the imperial endorsement and funding that came with Constantine's conversion, and consequently depictions of Jesus shifted from this to this. But the meaning of the Good Shepherd motif is determined not simply by its formal iconographic details, but also by the various cultural contexts, whether pagan, imperial, Christian, funerary, liturgical, public, personal, in which it was created and viewed. By tracing the ancient Near Eastern origins of the Good Shepherd motif, I hope to trouble this false dichotomy between the humble shepherd and the enthroned ruler. Because of its long history and application to ancient Near Eastern rulers and deities, I argue that the Good Shepherd motif carried connotations of both gentle caretaking and protection through violence into its early Christian spaces, and therefore, like the enthroned Christ, should be considered an image of power. So the first chapter starts in this ancient Near Eastern context. This chapter identifies the earliest known examples of this philanthropic shepherd motif, which are tied to both the practice of religion and the exercise of political power. Although the image of the Good Shepherd has come to be associated primarily with Jesus in contemporary context, and you can think of the kind of saccharine 20th century images, precious moments, and so on. Predated but it actually predates Christianity by thousands of years. Shepherding was an essential aspect of the agrarian and pastoral societies in the ancient Near East. One of the shepherd's central responsibilities was to protect his flock from theft and predators. In this regard, his tools were a crook or a staff, a sling, a bag of stones, and often a sheepdog. The shepherd's lifestyle rendered the staff as a cultural symbol of guidance and protection, and pastoral language became an effective tool in political propaganda throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The earliest references to a king as shepherd date back at least to the Old Akkadian period. So this is the 3rd millennium BCE. Numerous Mesopotamian rulers describe themselves with phrases such as born for shepherding and the shepherd of the city and the shepherd of the country. For example, the votive cone of the cuneiform inscription of Lipit-Eshtar in the top right refers to the ruler as a shepherd, plowman, and caretaker. Similarly, the temple brick below describes the king Bursin as the shepherd who satisfies the heart of the city of Ur, the strong plowman of Ur, and a worthy lord. These would be deposited in the foundations of buildings to be discovered by later rulers. Hammurabi's law code refers to him with multiple variations of the shepherd of the people and a shepherd who brings peace. And a popular Assyrian saying quipped to that quote, "A people without a king is like a sheep without a shepherd," which makes me think of Gloria Steinem. And also so. The Mesopotamian depictions of this motif date to about 1000 BCE, but are usually of men carrying gazelles, not sheep, on their shoulders, or maybe a sacrificial lamb or ram. So not a shepherding image per se, but one that's tied to temple sacrifice. This one is perhaps a shepherd here. So Mesopotamia had some degree of influence on Egyptian art and culture, enabled by pre-dynastic trade routes, possibly by way of Palestine. Whether or not the Egyptians gleaned their concept of the shepherd king from the Mesopotamians in particular, the earliest shepherd motif in Egypt seems to have manifested as an understanding of some gods as shepherds and protectors of the pharaoh, and then eventually that gets applied to the pharaoh himself. The shepherd motif was introduced into rulers' propaganda in the first intermediate period. That's late 3rd to 2nd millennium BCE, at a time when it was common for the head of the army and the head of the state to be the same person. The shepherd's crook and flail are ubiquitous in ancient Egyptian depictions of gods and pharaohs. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, was pictured in statues, relief carvings, and papyrus, as wearing a crown, holding the crook and flail with his legs bound in mummy wrappings. His crook and flail were absorbed from a Neji, a minor agricultural god, and in Lower Egypt, Osiris was also identified with the ram. Worshipped as both the king of the gods and the king of the living, Osiris was believed to judge the soul after death. Due in part to an origin story that identified him as a historical king, Osiris came to be associated with the deceased pharaoh. We see them depicted together. A product of the ancient Near Eastern culture, the Hebrew Bible contains several significant references to the idea of a shepherd ruler, including anecdotes characterized by kingship and/or violence. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are all portrayed as ideal shepherds, as are Joseph and Moses and even God. When Moses beseeches God for a leader, Moses echoes the Assyrian adage mentioned above, "May the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, provide a man that may be over this multitude, lest the people of the Lord be as a sheep without a shepherd." That's in Numbers 27. Moses himself becomes the leader of the Israelites, protecting his sheep from danger and leading them out of the sea, staff and all. King David is perhaps the ultimate shepherd ruler of the ancient world, or at least of the Hebrew Bible. Ezekiel prophesied that God had chosen this shepherd to be the prince over his goats or sheep and that's not right. To be sheep over his people. And it seems that his experience as an actual shepherd is what qualified him to rise through the ranks. When King Saul incredulously asked for his qualifications to fight Goliath, David explains, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears." So we think of maybe shepherding in this kind of like romantic pastoral sense, but in the ancient world, and still today, depending where you live, it is violent and dangerous, right? And it requires, like, yeah, you might be playing your flute in the fields a lot of the time, but then you have to be ready to spring into action to defend your flock with violence, right? So it was exactly this violent nature of shepherding that prepared David for battle with the giant. The self-sacrifice required of the shepherd mirrors that of a warrior and is later transposed onto the understanding of Jesus as the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, that kind of self-sacrificial defense of the flock. Even as a king, David continues to be described as a shepherd, as when God instructs Nathan to prophesy, quote, "I took you from the pasture, from attending the flock, and appointed you over my people Israel." I'm going quite quickly because it's a whole book. I'm trying to summarize. So you can buy the book and then you can see it. Okay, so the second chapter, I move on to the late antique context. And so this chapter traces the importation of that good shepherd motif into Greco-Roman culture, where it continued to convey religious and political and military power and guidance. The shepherd king was also ubiquitous in ancient Greek culture, which some scholars suggest had direct relationships to Egypt from at least the 7th century BCE. The earliest textual references that we find are in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer's 2 epic poems, composed in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, contain dozens of references to shepherds and their flocks, and apply the motif to designate both good and bad leadership. For example, in the Iliad's account of the Trojan War, Homer uses the vocabulary of shepherding to describe the negligence of a ruler, as when Diomedes and Odysseus take the Thracian camp at night while the king sleeps. There's one text of that. So there's lots of variations of this. The shepherd is gone. This group of people are vulnerable to attack. Not a literal shepherd, but their leader. And this particular vessel may date actually to maybe depicting this common, what's called kind of like a common Homeric theme, which is an army leaving or fleeing, but just note the little ram handles. But it may actually, because of its dating, may actually be depicting this flight of Agamemnon and Odysseus. But even more frequently than this kind of negative connotation, leaders such as Agamemnon and Nestor and Diomedes are positively described as shepherds of the people throughout Homer's poem, more than 40 times, actually. And that's just an Iliad. Indeed, this incredibly violent tale is teeming with pastoral language, but not in reference to peaceful, idyllic pastures. Rather, shepherd is applied to the key figures of the Iliad, warriors, gods, and rulers who are also agents of its violence. The Odyssey, which follows Odysseus' long, tumultuous journey back home to Ithaca after having fought in the Trojan War, also uses pastoral language throughout the poem. It applies shepherd of the people about a dozen times to leaders and rulers. The extensive influence of the Iliad and the Odyssey is evident more than 3 centuries later in Plato's work, in Plato's Minos, in which Socrates specifically references Homer's use of the phrase shepherd of the people. Additionally, while attempting to articulate a definition of law, Socrates likens rulers to shepherds. Quote, "Then it is the laws of the shepherd that are best for the sheep, and whose laws are best for the human souls? Isn't it that of the king? So the king is the shepherd and the people are the sheep." The shepherd's duty to guide and guard his flocks was consistently applied over the course of centuries to the responsibilities of both actual and theoretical rulers to govern and protect their subjects. The trope of the lazy or incompetent shepherd was used to denigrate poor rulers. Conversely, a ruler's subjects were often implicitly likened to a herd of mindless or expendable sheep. As Plato describes purging troublemakers from society as a shepherd purges sick or weak animals from a herd. Plato also compares gods to shepherds in terms of their rule, although he contrasts the god's amiable persuasion with the physical force employed by shepherds. Among the earliest visual depictions of the shepherd type in Greece is a terracotta Creophoros or ram bearer statuette dating to about the 7th century BCE. It is unique in that the figure is a warrior, complete with helmet, breastplate, and the distinctive warrior's belt, which is that crosshatch. Nearly contemporary with Homer, the statuette is a visualization of the shepherd imagery applied to warriors throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, such as the description of Achilles' shield, which bears images of cities, plowed fields, weddings, conflicts, as well as farmers, cattle, shepherds, and sheep. These pastoral images physically accompany Achilles into battle to avenge Patroclus's death. And that's a beautiful, there's tons of scholarship also on the imagery of his shield too. So there's this depiction of shepherding, like physically goes into battle on this shield. Greek gods were also depicted as shepherds. Hermes, who is known as the god who guided souls to the underworld and the patron of flocks and herds, was often represented as Hermes Creophoros, again, carrying a lamb or a ram on his shoulders or his arms. Images of Orpheus are found in mosaics, relief carvings, statues, and frescoes, which present him as a musician, a poet, philosopher, and guardian. He attempted to retrieve his lost love from Hades, and his enchanting music was known to tame wild animals. And he's thus frequently depicted in the Phrygian cap, which is shorthand for coming from the east, basically, in antique art, holding his lyre, and surrounded by animals, as we see in this landscape. And this will come back when we get into early Christian art because they are directly quoted. In short, more than 2,000 years before the emergence of Christianity, there was already an established tradition that linked the concept of a good shepherd with that of a good ruler and or military leader. The shepherd of the ancient Near East and ancient Greece also carried connotations of death and resurrection, as in the figures of Osiris and Orpheus. The next chapter I turn to, stay in the Levantine context, but turn to early Christianity. In this chapter, I'm trying to look at the Good Shepherd in the pre and post Constantinian church and arguing for continuity between those ancient Near Eastern connotations. So that is, the Good Shepherd is not merely this docile grassroots symbol, but continued to be an image of spiritual and political power, even in its Christian implications. This chapter also considers the possible intersections of visual depictions of the Good Shepherd in the Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God, in ecclesial spaces. And Jesus, the big thing here is that Jesus breaks that mold or subverts it because he is both the shepherd and the sacrificial lamb. So it's kind of riffing on, riffing on that. Early church authors took up the task of reconciling the shepherd imagery of the Hebrew Bible with that of the New Testament. For example, Clement of Alexandria compares Moses and Jesus as shepherds and lawgivers. He writes, "As then we say that it belongs to the shepherd's art to care for the sheep, and for so the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep, so also we shall say that legislation, inasmuch as it presides over and cares for the flock of men, establishes the virtue of men." So this God-ordained lawgiver. So Moses is lawgiver, Jesus is lawgiver, and this is a theme that then Christian rulers take up and align themselves with this idea of lawgiver. Christian authors appropriated pastoral and political language from their contemporary culture to argue that Moses and Jesus were both superior to any secular legislator. But patristic exegesis of pastoral passages is not limited only to this explication of biblical content, but also to its application in the contemporary lives of the faithful. For example, Ephraim of Syria hymned Jesus as a kingly shepherd in a baptismal context. Quote, "The sheep of Christ leaped for joy to receive the seal of life, that ensign of kings." So there's this branding, as a shepherd brands his sheep or his flock, so does God brand the faithful through the seal of baptism, is the thing they're making there. And some of the earliest Christian art that we have, you see this ring from the 3rd century, is signet rings that depict the Good Shepherd. So the Good Shepherd was ubiquitous in early Christian art, at least in part on account of its ready availability in Greco-Roman culture. So it's a theme that they can easily adapt. More than 2/3 of the 300 surviving examples of the Good Shepherd are found in funerary art, such as catacomb frescoes, sarcophagi, and epigraphs. The Good Shepherd also appears in several floor and wall mosaics, more than 20 statuettes, and about 100 terracotta lamps, and dozens of engraved gems and painted glass. Well, it's difficult to know whether many of these images were intended to symbolize Jesus or merely another personification of philanthropy, because even in a Christian context, it seems to be used both ways. Jesus was associated with visual depictions of the Good Shepherd as early as the late 1st century. So even before we have art that we can definitively identify as Christian, we have Christian texts that are talking about Jesus as the Good Shepherd outside of the biblical texts, like apostolic era. At least half of the surviving Good Shepherd images are found in Roman catacombs dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries. In these funerary contexts, the shepherd is a figure of deliverance and guidance to the afterlife, drawing on the traditions of Hermes and Orpheus that I just mentioned. In fact, Orpheus, identifiable by his lyre and Phrygian cap, is also found in several examples of early Christian funerary art and was likened to Jesus by patristic authors such as Clement of Alexandria. The iconography and context of these initial images do appear to be consistent with the humble ethos of the early church, and if anything, draw upon images of the Greco-Roman pantheon. However, the extensive oral history of the motif, along with the subsequent use by early Christian rulers, which we're going to turn to now, suggests that there's another side to this iconographic story. One of the most striking invocations of the Good Shepherd motif in an imperial context is that recorded by Constantine's biographer Eusebius, who explicitly likens Constantine to Jesus in his text in praise of Constantine. Just as Jesus, quote, "as the Good Shepherd drives far away from his flock like savage beasts those apostate spirits, so this friend subdues and chastens the open adversaries of the truth in accordance with the usages of war." And then this one as well. So that's about heresy. So he's now shepherding and protecting, not just from physical violence, but what's deemed heresy, right? So Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is Constantine's model for philanthropy, humility, and self-sacrifice. And this is this slide here. As a faithful shepherd, he offers not famous hecatombs of firstling lambs, but the souls of that flock, which is the object of his care, those rational beings whom he leads to the knowledge and pious worship of God. And that language also echoes in baptismal liturgies to the idea of rational sheep. So whether his Christian subjects would have regarded Constantine as a shepherd figure to the degree that Eusebius does, because of course that's a political imperial document, right? That's a PR kind of thing. We can only speculate. And to my knowledge, there are no visual representations of Constantine that invoke this Good Shepherd motif. But Book 4 of the Life of Constantine presents the piety of the Christian emperor, both in his personal devotion and in his public policies and actions. In one of the final chapters of the book, Eusebius describes the overwhelming reaction to Constantine's death. Quote, "Tribunes and centurions wept aloud for their savior, protector, and benefactor, and the rest of the troops suitably mourned like flocks for their good shepherd." So in the tradition of David and Christ, Constantine, guy who bankrolled the church, and according to some historians, contributed to its corruption, whatever that means, we could talk about that all day long. He was memorialized in this text as a shepherd to his subjects. The image I'm going to turn to now is for me kind of a turning point here. And it was, in fact, one of the things that got me going on this whole project to begin with. During the reign of Theodosius II, about a century later, a small cruciform structure was built in Ravenna, Italy, which contains the last public Good Shepherd image of early Christianity, with the next examples appearing in the Romanesque capitals in France. That's where we'll end our talk. And the north lunette of the so-called mausoleum of Baylor University, the composition of this peaceful bucolic scene recalls both Christian and pagan precedents. However, it differs significantly in its depiction of the person of the Good Shepherd. Unlike the ambiguous identity of the shepherd figures in most iconographic antecedents, this figure is clearly meant to be Jesus. His youthful beardless face is highlighted by a gold halo, and his shepherd's crook has been replaced with a gold cruciform staff, which may even be a reference to processional crosses that were used at the time. It's the meaning of that. In contrast to his usual humble garb, this Good Shepherd is wearing a gold tunic with deep blue stripes and a purple mantle that's draped over his shoulder and lap. The purple of this mantle, I think, is an unmistakable reference to the imperial purple. The composition of this lunette, combined with Jesus's dress and gesture, very closely resembles that of the mosaic of Orpheus dating to the 3rd or 4th century. Yeah, side by side, even with their nice little ankles up there. And thrown among the disciples, another likely influence for Christ's wardrobe here, though closer to home, is found in the late 4th century apse mosaic of Santa Fidenziana in Rome. And thrown among the disciples here, Jesus is also dressed in a golden tunic with the same vertical deep blue stripes. Thomas Matthews has argued that both the gold of the garment and the imposing throne are attributes of Roman divinity and not empire, and he makes no comment about the use of purple in the Gallipopeia mosaic. So here I push back on Matthews' interpretation. I don't think it's necessary or realistic to limit the influence of such images to either pagan or imperial imagery. I think it's both. It's a both and. It's a classic united both and. So this lunette here in the mausoleum of Gallipopeia, I think, is a really helpful example, or almost an ultimate visualization of the imperial connotations that were already present in the Good Shepherd before we get to this image. But this one embodies a kind of convergence of these elements that are Good Shepherd, empire, pantheon, right? And visualizes this guidance, power, and divinity, and even violence. It does, after this, give way to the enthroned Jesus of Apps mosaics that we'll see in the following centuries. So here's one example. This is found just steps away from the mausoleum of Galliplacidia in Ravenna, made about a century later. My analysis of San Vitale focuses on the mosaics of the nave, the depiction of Abel the shepherd, and especially on the multiple depictions of Moses, who's shepherd and lawgiver. And these images, the image on the left there is directly to the left of Abel and Melchizedek. And then this image on the right is on the opposite wall. So it's kind of like Moses is flanking you there. And we see Moses taking off his sandals, and instead of, I really love this, instead of one fiery bush, it's just like a whole landscape of little flames. And there is Moses the shepherd, with a little scroll here. And here he's receiving the 10 commandments from God.
Very tiny.
Very tiny 10 commandments. Well, they're rolled up. So it's not tablets, it's a scroll.
Compact.
Yeah. And the hand of God up here as well. I focus on the images of Moses. I think that they're especially interesting in light of the legal reform that the Emperor Justinian had executed during the first few years of his reign. The Corpus Juris Civilis updated and reorganized the Roman laws of the previous 3 centuries. In it, Justinian surpassed the 5th century legal achievements of Theodosius II. Justinian's legislative code would go on to be used in influential and legal systems for the next millennium. All of which is to say that, like Moses with the 10 commandments and Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, Justinian was also a famed lawgiver, and his legacy, I think, is reinforced in the mosaic program at San Vitale. San Vitale's images of Moses, Abraham, Abel, and Melchizedek reflect the priesthood of Jesus as described in the Epistle to the Hebrews. In the New Testament text, these figures are presented as models of faith and are linked to Jesus, though they ultimately fall short of the one who is the high priest, quote unquote, in the order of Melchizedek, a priest who is the mediator of the new covenant, according to Hebrews 9:15, and offers himself as sacrifice, thus obtaining eternal redemption, Hebrews 9:12. In the physical space of San Vitale, I think the proximity of Moses, Abraham, Abel, and Melchizedek to Justinian's own portrait in the altar space, he and Theodora are flanking the altar, work together, and then these repeated images of offering, right, received offering, not only reinforce the Eucharistic symbolism that would have been extended to the celebration of the Eucharist below on the altar, but also arguably work in concert to present Justinian offering a similarly pleasing sacrifice to God in his own role as ruler and shepherd and priest-like, right? Not actually priest, but in terms of the relationship between empire and church. I can't get into this because of time, but I conclude this chapter by looking at the influence of Gregory the Great's Book of Pastoral Rule, which, unlike the imperial shepherd, who governs a flock of citizens with the goal of subordination and control, describes the ecclesial shepherd, that is clergy and bishops and so on, as guiding these reason-endowed sheep in his image and then ultimately in that of Jesus. So the point for the distinction between imperial shepherd and ecclesial shepherd is, in theory, that in the case of the ecclesial shepherd, it's a model for spiritual, behavior or formation and so on, right? Of course, powers in both of those spheres. I also consider the theme of the Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God motif, which is based in biblical passages like Revelation 7:17, and visualizes Jesus's paradoxical identity as both shepherd and sheep. But again, for the sake of time, we can't go there. So we'll just wrap up by talking about the last chapter. And this is one where I look to the early Middle Ages and kind of what I profess to be like the waning of the imperial invocation of the Good Shepherd. And so the tide turns of it. The conception of the shepherd as guide, protector, and judge, which has been complexified through its encounter with early Christianity, continued to prove useful for early medieval emperors, especially Charlemagne, who is described as such by several biographers. Not unlike the days of Constantine, Charlemagne the shepherd protected the flock from heresy and threat of violence. So here's a poem by one of his court theologians, Theodore of Orleans, and especially, he's locating Charlemagne's reign geographically, wider than the Nile, larger than the frosty Danube, And then also biblically, and historically. So talking about Charlemagne's own lineage, and then comparing it to Solomon and David and Joseph. So it's geographical, biblical, historical. And in the center of this particular stanza, he says, "No wonder the eternal shepherd created such a shepherd to pasture his flock." So we have Charlemagne the shepherd, and his pasturing is protecting the flock from heresy, and of course then all the other things associated with the ruler. And in his forced conversion of the Saxons, that shepherding imagery is also used. So for example, the anonymous Poeta Saxo, the Saxon poet, wrote that Charlemagne, quote, "changed savage wolves into gentle lambs." And this anonymous Saxon poet also compares Charlemagne to the apostles and to evangelists, and also compares him to, it's like Orpheus tamed the wild animals, and like Jesus tames the wild soul, so does Charlemagne tame the wild heathens, right, and converts them at sword, right, this forced conversion. So it's being used, in other words, the shepherding imagery is being used both politically and religiously, and those are intertwined. Both Charlemagne and his son Louis were nicknamed David, which is an invocation, of course, of this biblical kingship. And there are a handful of depictions of David as a shepherd in Carolingian manuscripts, such as this one from the Utrecht Psalter. From right to left, and it's accompanied by Psalm 151. David is pictured slaying Goliath on the far right, and the Utrecht Psalter is really fascinating because it's this kind of sketchy, unfinished looking penwork. It's not painted, the images. We see David here, Goliath down here. Here's David the shepherd with his crook upside down there, being addressed by an angel at his organ. And then, this is a psalmist.
You had that then.
And then here seated, enthroned, and flanked by, so he's wearing a crown and then flanked by soldiers. So we have this register which doesn't depict a linear narrative, but is showing things out of order, and thereby simultaneously presenting David as king and poet and shepherd and warrior. And you have these spears and the shepherd crook and everything, this kind of action. The shepherd crook is also in this first image on the right too. And in the chapter, I go through from Charlemagne through his descendants into the Ottonian dynasty as well. But of course, we can talk about that. So there's several, I think, possible reasons for this, what I see as like a decline in the imperial use of shepherding imagery. It is present, but it seems to not be at the fore, and is replaced in some ways by, I think, an interest in David, which isn't to say it's not completely. So some of these reasons for the decline of the imperial use of shepherding imagery during this period include a formalization of the priesthood as a ministerium, as a ministry proper, and this is expressed in some Carolingian capitula that was like official degrees by the empire. And so this further solidified the association between the Good Shepherd and church leadership that had been endorsed earlier in Gregory the Great's pastoral rule. By casting their roles in the image of the Good Shepherd, church leaders connected themselves directly with Jesus and notions of humility and self-sacrifice. Although the Good Shepherd did not disappear completely from imperial language by the end of the Carolingian era, it had been effectively replaced by the distinct but related idea of the Davidic kingdom. That Carolingian rulers increasingly cast themselves as inheritors of biblical kingship in both text and image. They might also reflect a shift from that earlier role as defenders from heresy to an emphasis on the Christian emperor as lawgiver. And they have these different legal reforms associated with legal rulers. In both court chronicles and images, the Carolingians interwove the Davidic Good Shepherd, which enabled regal symbolism without losing the power of the Good Shepherd motif completely, throughout their complex political and theological conceptions of power and rule. So it's still there, but maybe in the background. I conclude this chapter by looking at the few large-scale images of the Good Shepherd and then the reemergence of the shepherd in sculpture, where it appeared on the margins as a humorous or menacing figure, perhaps faintly echoing the bucolic poems of antiquity, or more likely reflecting local social context in the 12th century. Lately, shepherds were also employed to symbolize the labors of the spring months of March, April, and May, and as standard figures in occupational scenes, evidence of the persisting importance of shepherding in local economies and cultures, because of course, as I do note in my book, there are like actual shepherds running around during this time. So, because of who's commissioning artwork and all those kinds of things, it's necessarily and largely associated with empire and the upper classes and so on. So the lives of actual shepherds, we don't have much access to in the historical record. In my conclusion, I do talk about a 14th century treatise on shepherding that was written by an actual shepherd. And so I kind of land my plane there. and even he is, Jean de Brie is his name, even he is aware of that, or makes an occasional reference to shepherding as an imagery for rulers. But mostly he's focusing on, the stuff you need to have in your shepherd's bag and what you need to do when it rains and all kinds of practical things. So, but nevertheless, the Good Shepherd continued to be found in ecclesial texts well after it disappeared from the monumental visual depictions and imperial rhetoric. So it moves from that last image of Gallipopedia in her mausoleum, the kind of bedazzled Good Shepherd here, to a literally marginal image in a capital in a church, right? So it's along the nave of the church. Moving to the later Middle Ages, the figure of the Good Shepherd in both text and image was applied exclusively to Jesus and to the church leaders that represented him on earth. In contrast to early Christian depictions in which the Good Shepherd was a type for Jesus and not strictly a portrait, late medieval versions explicitly identify him as Jesus through the inclusion of a cruciform halo, and in some cases, the visible wounds of his passion. This one I find delightful because he's the sheep and the shepherd in the same image. He's the sheep and shepherds other sheep. That's pretty meta. So to wrap things up, you like that one? So in this whole project, right, my contention is that the Good Shepherd is in fact a much more complex and compelling figure than has previously been considered. Rather than anti-imperial, the Good Shepherd is more accurately understood as another facet of Christian imperial iconography, and in that sense indicates more continuity before and after the legalization of Christianity. So there's not this, I'm trying to push back on that harsh break between Christianity is legalized, it gets imperialized, and then everything, goes to hell. And I'm trying to say it already went to hell before that. There's already empire associated, but they're subverting that. So it's kind of that both end, right? This is evidence too when the shepherd is followed into the early Middle Ages, where it continued to be invoked by rulers, even as these monumental depictions decreased. But there seems to have been a shift to marginal humorous representations of the shepherd. So that previous image I showed you, this is not Jesus the Good Shepherd. I don't think he sticks out his tongue properly. So this is a bucolic scene. This is a shepherd, right? But this could be, in the 12th century, can be explained by the increase in sheep husbandry during that period, and there's a group of those capitals that are all in the same region in France, and so there's something kind of local happening there. The rare 12th century examples of the kind of quote unquote classical Good Shepherd iconography are then likely a result of the renewed interest in classical texts and images that were characteristic of the so-called 12th century Renaissance. Taking seriously the long history of the Good Shepherd from its ancient Near Eastern origins to its waning in the Middle Ages, as if following that very shepherds that moved their flocks across the varied landscapes of the pre-modern world, reveals a complex and often contradictory figure. Okay. Woo. So we have Sean the sheep also. We have some time for comments or questions.
Yeah. Can we applaud?
I mentioned. Yay. Oh no, I can do it. I mentioned as we were getting started, Jess and I are just coming from Intro to Pastoral Care class with Dr. Chapman Lake, and we were talking about the image of shepherd and how that is still very much part of the dominant ethos and writing about pastoral care in that particular field and history. And there's different versions of it. There's like the solicitous shepherd, there's the courageous shepherd, and so there's a little bit of diversity in there, but there's definitely, one critique we were talking about in class is this power dynamic, which you sort of laid out in like an art historical way. That's very helpful. So one question I have for you, in kind of complicating the origin of the shepherd image and how that relates to Christianity, but how that obviously comes from, more than, just a Christian lineage. Because I think one thing we talked about is like, oh, well, this is problematic because it's just a Christian thing. And it's clear that it's not. So I'm wondering, and another thing we talked about is like how it's very masculine. So it's like tender yet tough shepherd who's going to help you. I'm wondering how you would, given that the shepherd is here to stay in some shape or form, how you would rehabilitate that image or possibilities for rehabilitating it, given its like more complex history.
Yeah.
But like one thing was coming up for me as you're talking about like the actual shepherds. I'm like, the job isn't just killing things, it's also probably like being a doula to little baby sheep.
Right.
Like you're also doing a lot of other weird labor that's not necessarily associated with masculinity or like that gender. So
there's different in some of the there's some Greco-Roman texts that I talk about in the book where the role that shepherds play in literature, for example, which is often like marginal kind of characters, because in some cases they're suspect a little bit because they're just out hanging out in the they have this kind of unique job where they're hanging around sometimes, and then so they're like in a workforce that's not always incorporated maybe or thought of as being in society in some ways. But the function that they serve in some literature is as like humorous characters or body kind of characters. I totally forgot what your question was actually. It was about rehabilitating
the shepherd image and pastoral care.
Yeah.
Like other possibilities could be played with.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too of like, well, I guess what got me on that was like just like the multiple. I think the thing that's exciting to me about it is it's not just this two-dimensional concept or character that we encounter it a lot. And I think I mentioned like at the end of the book, like Protestant, like 19th, 20th century Protestant images of the Good Shepherd, which are the real like sentimental ones. And I think that it just removes it so much from its historical context. So and so that's a whole nother thing. But I think to like lean into the historical diversity of it and the origins, and it comes from because it resonated. We're talking about like largely Mediterranean culture in the ancient world, and so there's a lot of agrarian cultures where shepherding is a common image. That's why it worked. The same thing with like grapes and like ideas of harvest. These are things that resonate, and so Christians can have images of grapes in their catacombs, and it becomes a Eucharistic reference, but it's already part of Mediterranean culture. And there's these kinds of like the way that, well, we'll talk about it in class this afternoon too, like visual studies and like this idea of like how images do things and work. So I'm thinking especially of like art historical examples like you pointed out, but I think that the shepherd, I was focusing on the violent aspect of it and the imperial aspect of it because I wanted to push back against that kind of romanticizing. But you're right in that like actual shepherds would have ointments. I mean, they would have, they had some basic like veterinary kind of like knowledge, right? Like you said, that they would have to help birth these animals. The treatise that I was talking about like talks about ways to use the materials, and so there's this like relationship that they have. I don't know. Lisa.
On the same kind of note, what I'm seeing that you're not talking about is the socio-political change and what that's doing to the agrarian sort of format. So back in that sort of pre-Christian position when shepherds are fighting lions and bears, right? As you move into the city-state, as you move into these larger imperial places, shepherds are even more removed from society and are less likely to run into those particular kinds of really big dangers. Fighting a lone wolf is not as bad as fighting a lion. Right. And as we progress in our sort of political agrarian culture. Now, none of us have any attachment to what shepherding really is, and our sense of animal husbandry is, these farming, industrial farming complexes, and it's entirely removed,
Yeah,
other than in that romantic sense,
yeah,
from the reality of this. And so I'm interested in how to reform that, but also in the context of, what do I say, just ecology.
yeah,
And to move that into let's get to know shepherding other than at the petting zoo at the Renaissance Fair. And because I think that's a lot of what Christianity is dealing with too,
Yeah.
right? Christianity is removed from reality for a lot of people, and I think COVID has made that even worse.
yeah, yeah.
Is that people have lost touch
Yeah.
that way. So that's,
Yeah, and I guess I'd say too that, some of the Imperial, for the same reasons, like even in these historical instances where they're using the shepherding imagery, a lot of the emperors who are using that imagery are not tied to, like, they're also out of touch, right? Even in that time, they don't know, yeah.
Well, that seems like a difference between the biblical, right? Because the rich people in the at least in the Hebrew Bible, are shepherds, and the poor people are often shepherds. Versus
Yeah,
yes.
the rich, the rich people are not necessarily shepherds, like Abimelech or the kind of characters in the Hebrew Bible. They just have better sheep and more of them, and more people to take care of. But it seems like part of it, the common thing where taking a primarily smaller communities stories and then applying it to empire, suddenly that changes what a shepherd is too.
yeah. Do you want to, Max, comment on what you put in the chat, or do you want me to read it? Or
Sure, yeah. What and I'm sort of relating this to a different question as well, around class with the shepherd. But yeah, one thing that I'm thinking of, I mean, Orpheus and some of these characters that, um, and ideas about shepherds, at least, I mean, it's in Greek stuff. It's definitely in Roman literature. It's definitely all over Ovid and, um, sort of, and Virgil and others, of the there's something sexually suspect of the shepherd, and early on in Greek poetry as well, just the idea that, like, Pan, the god Pan, is associated with shepherds and taught shepherds how to masturbate or taught homosexual love. Similarly, Orpheus, that's one of the things that he taught. He taught all this, resurrection soul stuff, but he also taught pederasty, same-sex pederasty. And so I'm just wondering how that did or didn't play into some of the changes also, with Jesus. I mean, he's a, like, muscly-ish, young dude that is very attractive according to, like, certain societal norms in these early depictions. And then the sort of bearded figure, not necessarily unattractive, but it seems like a less sexually dangerous image, or one that's less likely to be confused, by the populace. I'm wondering if sexuality plays a role in the change.
yeah, I talk about some of those in that late antique chapter, some of the stuff with Ovid and like I was just saying, yeah, the kind of literary uses of sheep and shepherds.
Yeah.
The images of Jesus, like, I mean, because it's depicted as both bearded and not bearded immediately in early Christianity. And then also through, I think of what the latest, like, non-bearded images of Jesus are.
I mean, like, did he have a razor? Like, why are we? I don't understand where that part is coming from.
Sure, he had a razor.
Yeah, okay, good.
Scissors, razors, yeah. ancient folks were very interested in grooming
Well, and they were sharing their sheep.
and they're shearing their
That's
sheep.
true.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I mean, we could do a whole other thing on like depictions of Jesus and like ideas of beauty or not, because that varies from time to time, and even his body, which sometimes is depicted as more feminine, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Like in the Aryan baptistry is one example, or and even in the later Middle Ages.
Yeah. I still think the related question though is about class. Like what, I mean, and I think it was coming to also what Lisa was saying, just like what class, I mean, I don't know, like if you are poor, you can relate to Jesus as a shepherd, and if you are rich, you could relate to him as a shepherd. When did that change, I guess, or did that change? Um, was there a problem with that relationship? That's sort of, and
And
I think
relating to that, people would be relating to Jesus as a shepherd if they could like imagine themselves as a shepherd.
I guess so. I mean, there's, even if the shepherd is an imperial image consistently throughout ancient times, it's also a day-to-day image.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and I'm not. It seems like, at least from the images you show, he's, me looking at it, it seems less day to day. You know, with not just partly there's the gold halos and the, which might not just be Christian, but it is like imperial or whatever.
Yeah.
These rich fabrics, holding gold as opposed to holding just a wooden staff, certain things like that. I'm curious.
Specifically in the Christian iconography.
Yeah, and I'm just curious. Like, is there a class component? Do you think to the change over time?
Yeah, I mean that might track along with that might track along with imperialization of Christianity, but the thing is that what I'm also tracking is that there aren't monumental depictions of the Good Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
After that Gallipopedia one, there's not a big public image of the Good Shepherd. And so it doesn't, you see it in illuminated manuscripts that are maybe illustrating the Psalms or something like that.
Yeah.
That's an image that is not accessible to everybody because most people would not be literate, most people would not be owning books in the Middle Ages. So there's that aspect. I'm thinking even like in Greco-Roman culture though, where you have like pastoral scene, like scenes of the hunt or scenes of picnics or harvests that are these kind of like quotidian, daily kind of activities. Those would be in the house of somebody who could have artwork, so like it all depends. Yeah. But I don't think it's to say that all depictions of the Good Shepherd in the Christian Middle Ages are like bedazzled. I didn't find that there were, it's mentioned in texts, it's mentioned in sermons, of course, because they're preaching on the Bible. So it's always going to be there in some way. But that the Good Shepherd isn't showing up in these, there's like a gap of several centuries, and then shepherding imagery kind of reemerges in the Romanesque period. And that's, I think, is in part because of economic prosperity in the 12th century. And so there's more building campaigns and there's more artwork being made, and so it's related like that.
You have a question for you?
Well,
For
again,
you.
yeah, I've got on one plot. Just a quick question. Given the plethora of female figures in the Greco-Roman context,
Yeah.
the empowerment of women seen in some of the early writings, did you not, could there have been more resources appropriated that would subvert the kind of patriarchal trajectory?
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned shepherd. I have like a little thing on shepherdesses, but they're just like, I did not find much. Yeah.
There's some.
And I think because they're being used, well, one is Hatshepsut in the, one of the female pharaohs who also has the crook and flail.
Yeah.
So that's an ancient example. But in Christian context and not seeing, female shepherding imagery applied in the way that it is. I have a little section on Hildegard of Bingen who uses it against rulers, but she's, so there's some of that, and I maybe
I
could
haven't
have.
got that far.
Okay, well,
I'm just as far as 111 now. so.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I could, it's the kind of thing where you can always find more, and I'm not a modernist, but I wanted to kind of follow it into the modern era and see where it gets used, right, by contemporary rulers, because I know some.
This was fabulous.
Thanks for coming.
Deeply learned. Proud of you.
Thank you. Nancy. Okay, I know we're at time, and I saw Patty, you put something there, maybe we could chat later. Thanks everyone for coming, I know next time. Next week.